Well, this is Eric Michael Lloyd. I have a master's in clinical psychology, neuropsychology concentration. I want to read an article from Dialogues in Clinical Neuroscience, Psychopathy, Cognitive and Neural Dysfunction. This one is by R. James R. Blair, PhD. This is another NIH article. They also have this one in English, Spanish, and French, which is very interesting. This article was published in 2013, June of that year. Abstract. Psychopathy is a developmental disorder marked by emotional deficits and an increased risk for antisocial behavior. It is not equivalent to the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, which concentrates only on the increased risk for antisocial behavior and not a specific cause, i.e., reduced empathy and guilt that constitutes the emotional deficit. The current review considers data from adults with psychopathy with respect to the main cognitive accounts of the disorder that stress either primary attention deficit or a primary emotion deficit. In addition, the current review considers data regarding neural biology of this disorder. Dysfunction within the amygdala's role in reinforcement learning and the role of ventral medial frontal cortex in the representation of reinforcement value is stressed. Data is also presented indicating potential difficulties within parts of temporal and posterior cingulate cortex. Suggestions are made with respect to why these deficits lead to the development of the disorder. Introduction. The importance of multiple levels of analysis for the understanding of psychiatric conditions is clear. To understand a disorder, we need to specify its behavioral profile, i.e., its clinical description. The functional impairments that give rise to this behavior profile, for example, cognitive psychology, and the neural systems that mediate these functions, for example, systems neuroscience. The molecular level factors that are impacting on the neural systems, for example, molecular neuroscience, and the genetic bases of these molecular level factors. The aim of the current paper is to summarize the psychopathy literature on the first of these three levels. Currently, molecular neuroscience work on this disorder is in its infancy. There has been recent concern regarding the heterogeneity in the findings, particularly the structural and functional imaging findings on adults with psychopathy. Indeed, an uncritical eye might consider most of cortex dysfunctional in this population. A recent review raised important methodological issues regarding the subject population, questioning, for example, whether findings from patient forensic populations where psychopathy might be indexed by in-depth clinical interview are directly comparable with studies where psychopathic traits are measured by healthy subjects' self-report. While studies on healthy individuals are important, they allow dimensional work that is particularly useful for genetic analysis. The concern is that if we are unconfident about the neurobiological basis of the disorder, studies in healthy individuals may simply confuse the field. Considering this, they will not be considered in this current review. Three other constraints should be mentioned regarding papers included in this review. First, a striking number of the published magnetic resonance imaging studies did not match groups for IQ. Such matching is typical in the neuropsychological literature, but it is not consistent in MRI studies with this population. A failure to match for IQ can lead to some misleading results. See also the structural MRI, SMRI section below. At the very least, it means that it is impossible to conclude that a result reflects the disorder rather than simply the impact of IQ on brain structure or function. Consequently, studies where IQ was not clearly matched will not be considered in the current review. One exception is made for some recent provocative data. However, Second, this review considers adults with psychopathy. As such, studies with youth with psychopathic traits will not be extensively reviewed. Third, only results replicated in at least one other paper will be considered. For example, isolated findings of a reduction in cortical volume in a particular area, not replicated in at least one other paper, will not be considered. Psychopathy, the behavioral profile. Psychopathy is a disorder characterized by pronounced emotional deficits, marked by reduction in guilt and empathy, and involves increased risk for displaying antisocial behavior. The disorder is developmental. Psychopathic traits, particularly the emotional component, are relatively stable from childhood to adulthood. One reason for the attention this classification receives is its strong predictive utility for institutional adjustment and recidivism, i.e., reoffending. Individuals with psychopathy are approximately 3 times more likely to reoffend than those with low psychopathic traits, and 4 times more likely to reoffend violently. Admittedly, it is the past antisocial behavior indexed by psychopathy assessments that is particularly important in predicting future criminal activity. However, it is the emotional component that characterizes psychopathy. High levels of antisocial behavior can develop from other neurobiological and socio-environmental risk factors. Psychopathy is not equivalent to the DSM-4 diagnosis of conduct disorder or antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, or their ICD-10 counterparts. Psychiatric diagnosis focuses on antisocial behavior rather than underlying causes, i.e., the emotion dysfunction seen in psychopathy. As a consequence, individuals meeting this criteria for antisocial personality disorder are more heterogeneous in their pathophysiology than individuals meeting criteria for psychopathy. Psychopathy, the cognitive profile. Before continuing, it is worth noting that the term cognitive is being used to refer to all relevant computations conducted by the brain. Sometimes the term affective is used with respect to emotional processes. However, for the purposes of this paper, affective processing will be considered as simply another form of cognitive processing. With respect to cognitive dysfunction in psychopathy, the disorder is particularly interesting given the selectivity in the impairments seen. Thus, for example, executive function, theory of mind, and episodic memory, as long as it does not rely on augmentation by emotional content, are intact in individuals with this disorder. Indeed, the two main classes of model of psychopathy concentrate on only 2 forms of dysfunction: attentional and emotional processing. Psychopathy as a disorder of attention. The response set modulation hypothesis. According to the response modulation hypothesis, the difficulty faced by individuals with a psychopathy relates to a problem in reallocating attention to secondary information when engaged in goal-directed behavior. This difficulty in balancing the demands of goal-directed processing and secondary information processing creates a bias whereby psychopathic individuals are less responsive to effective information unless it is a central aspect of their goal-directed focus of attention. It is argued that psychopathic individuals initially perceive and identify both primary and secondary information, but are particularly adept at using higher order processes to resolve the competition between goal-relevant and secondary demands on attention, page 227. The authors argue that these higher order processes create an early attention bottleneck that limits the processing of secondary information. Typically, an early attention bottleneck has implied that only physical and not abstract properties of a secondary stimulus are processed. The bottleneck occurs within the visual stream, with early processing corresponding to physical feature as opposed to abstract feature processing. However, Newman and colleagues use the term in a temporal sense. Processing by higher order processes of the first stimulus in a sequence of stimuli acts as a bottleneck for processing the second stimulus in a sequence. It is clear that regions implicated in top-down attentional control, i.e., higher order attentional processes, such as lateral frontal, dorsal medial, and parietal cortices, impact the amygdala's response to emotional stimuli. Increased priming of task-relevant representations by these regions is thought to reduce the representational strength of emotional stimuli within the temporal cortex following representational competition, and consequently reduce amygdala responses to these stimuli. In short, the reduced emotional responsiveness of individuals with elevated psychopathic traits could be a secondary consequence of heightened top-down attentional control to non-emotional stimulus features. In recent studies in adults with psychopathy, Newman and colleagues manipulated attention either towards the threat-relevant component of a stimulus array or away from this component and examined fear-related startle, fear-potentiated startle, FPS. In each of these studies, psychopathy scores were significantly inversely related to FPS under conditions that required participants to focus on a threat-irrelevant dimension of stimuli. In contrast, psychopathy scores were unrelated to FPS when attention was focused on the threat-relevant dimension. These studies provide important support for the suggestion that it is an attentional abnormality rather than a problem in emotional responding that is central to an understanding of psychopathy. Given the literature on the interaction of top-down attentional control and emotional responding, these data should suggest that psychopathy is related to enhanced recruitment of regions implicated in top-down attentional control. For example, dorsal medial and lateral frontal and parietal cortices. Dorsal medial, lateral frontal, and parietal cortices. The stronger these are recruited as a function of psychopathy, the stronger the priming of threat-irrelevant stimulus dimensions. The weaker the representation of threat-relevant stimulus dimensions following representational competition, and the weaker the emotional response. However, there are at least 5 reasons to be cautious. First, while these are correlational studies within a forensic sample, and thus studies where IQ could not be matched across groups, it remains critical to show that IQ did not correlate with psychopathy level. Otherwise, the results might reflect the influence of IQ rather than psychopathy. However, this matching was not done. Second, only the individuals with psychopathy showed an impact of the attentional manipulation. Individuals low in psychopathy showed no differentiation in their fear-potentiated startle as a function of whether attention was directed towards or away from threat-relevant stimulus features. It is currently unclear why this paradigm contrasts with other work showing that manipulations of attention do have an impact on emotional responding in healthy individuals. Third, while superior recruitment of top-down attentional control systems would result in reduced emotional responses to emotional stimuli that are not the focus of attention, there are no indications of increased recruitment of such systems in the studies showing reduced amygdala responses to emotional stimuli in adults with psychopathy. Fourth, several studies have shown reduced FPS in individuals with psychopathy to environmental threats in the absence of task demands to attention to other stimulus features. It is unclear that early stimuli are blocking the processing of the threat prime in these studies. Fifth, if higher order processing of the first stimulus in a sequence of stimuli acts as a bottleneck for processing the second stimulus in a sequence, why is the attentional blink apparently decreased in individuals with psychopathy? In attentional blink experiments, 2 targets are embedded within a stream of distractors in a rapid serial visual presentation with second T2 appearing at different temporal lags in relation to the first T1. The classic pattern of results identified in the attentional blink task reflects a participant's reduced ability to report the identity of T2 if it is presented between approximately 100 milliseconds and 600 milliseconds after onset of T1. One might have considered that the bottleneck created by the first target stimulus should prevent the processing of later stimuli in the sequence. However, the data indicates that targets presented after the target at least at lag 4, 320 milliseconds and greater, are more likely to be recognized in individuals with psychopathy relative to controls. The authors make reference to an interpretation of the attentional blink as reflecting the conflict between consolidating one's perception of TI and reallocating attention in response to a lag 1 distractor. They argue that because of reduced representation of lag 1 distractor, less conflict is generated and there is more possibility of allocating attention to stimuli greater than lag 1 after the target. The difficulty for this explanation is that it would predict reduced accuracy for the lag F distractor, reflecting its reduced representation, and this was not seen. In summary, 20 years after its development, the response set modulation hypothesis remains highly influential. We have not attempted a full critique here, but instead have concentrated on the newest version of the model suggesting an early attentional bottleneck. Irrespective of the difficulties, it has been highly successful in generating a wide array of paradigms for understanding the disorder, with some of the data from these paradigms proving challenging for emotion-based views of psychopathy. I'm just going to leave it off right there. I don't want to make the video too long, and I'll start back with the next part, emotion-based accounts. Thank you.